Well, hi everyone. My name is Liz. I'm the administrative assistant in the research office. We are going to get started shortly. We'll probably give another few minutes just for people to trickle in. I do want to mention that we are evaluating all of our 150th events and this series as well. And we would love it if people took the time to complete our evaluation form. We're just trying to track how we can do better at future events and everything. So I'm just putting that in the chat right now. So that's there. Yeah, we'd really appreciate that. And maybe I'll ask Jackie now, who is our Associate Vice President Research here at MSVU, to officially begin our event.
Great, thanks so much, Liz. Welcome, everybody. Bonjour tout le monde. I'm Jackie Gahagan, the Associate Vice President here at Mount St. Vincent University, and it's my pleasure to welcome you here for what will be, I'm sure, an excellent talk by Dr. Margaret Robinson. Before we get started, I would like to acknowledge that Mount St. Vincent University is located on unceded ancestral Mi'kmaq territory. This territory is covered by the covenant of chains of treaties of peace and friendship signed between 1725 and 1779. We pay respect to the knowledge embedded in the Indigenous custodians of this land and to the elders past, present, and future. I also just wanted to thank Liz for her great work in supporting the coordination of today's event. And I would also just like to note, thank you, Liz, to note that Mount St. Vincent University's Black and Indigenous Speaker Series highlights the scholarly work of Black and Indigenous scholars from across Turtle Island. And the purpose of this series is to initiate important conversations by inviting Black and Indigenous scholars to share their knowledge, their worldviews, and their contributions to their respective academic fields. So again, thank you and welcome to everyone. I'll be joining you back. I'll be staying on the line to wrap up, but I'm really looking forward to Margaret's talk. So I'll stop there. Thanks.
Thanks, Jackie. I'd now like to introduce Emily Pictou-Roberts, who is the auntie in residence here at MSVU, and Emily's going to be introducing Margaret for us today. So over to you, Emily.
G'day, everyone, and Vulalin so much, Elizabeth, for setting this all up. I'm here to introduce Dr. Margaret Robinson. I've had the pleasure of having Dr. Margaret Robinson as a professor myself at Dal many years ago. Yeah, I'm very, very excited to have this opportunity. So Dr. Margaret Robinson is a two-spirit Mi'kmaq scholar from Eskikewákik and a member of Lennox Island First Nation. Dr. Robinson earned a PhD from the University of Toronto and conducts community-based research with Indigenous and LGBTQ+ people. Dr. Robinson works as an associate professor at Dalhousie University in the departments of English and of Sociology and Social Anthropology, where she holds her Tier 2 Canada Research Chair in Reconciliation, Gender and Identity. Margaret, thank you so much for joining us. We are all so excited to hear your presentation titled Taking Up Too Much Space, How Health Research Problematizes Indigenous Women's Body Size. Thank you so much and take it away.
Thanks for having me here. I'll share my screen and show you my slides. Are those visible?
Looks great.
Terrific.
Yeah,
okay. So I'll start by saying thanks for coming out for this. I apologize. April is a time when I often get my allergies kick in, so my eyes may run a bit as I talk. In this talk, I'm going to discuss how some of cultural images that we use shape how we approach Indigenous health. And I'll show you some examples of those sort of images. And then I'll talk about how fatness has been framed in Indigenous health research, and I'll relate it to some of the images we've looked at. And then finally, I'll look at how some of these concepts come together in a particular Health Canada poster. But first, I'll start by talking about how is it that I came to start doing critical fat studies. And for me, it came through doing queer health research. So in 2014, I was a research assistant for Rainbow Health Ontario. They're an organization that produce fact sheets and information for people who work in the medical services. And with Rainbow Health Ontario, I helped organize a talk by Charlotte Cooper, who's a fact activist scholar. And we later co-wrote a fact sheet called A Critical Understanding of Weight in LGBT Communities, which I'm not entirely sure why, but is no longer available. And then in 2015, because of having done that work with Cooper, I got invited to join a study funded by Women's College Hospital. And the study was run by Jen Rinaldi, and it looked at queer women's body image and body management practices. And then from that, I started learning more about fat issues and critical fat theory. That developed the book Thickening Fat, which is a book project run by Dr. Rinaldi, also with Dr. May Friedman and Dr. Carla Rice. And since then, I've been supporting fat activism, fat scholarship, particularly as a guest editor for the Canadian Women's Studies special issue on feminist revisioning of fat, and as a member of the editorial board for Excessive Bodies, which is a new fat scholarly journal. So the material I'm going to show you today comes from my book chapter in Thickening Fat. Some of the scholarly frameworks that I find useful for doing this work, apart from critical fat studies, come from queer activism. Particularly here, the image up on the left, a group called Pretty Porky and Pissed Off, which was performing in Toronto when I was doing my master's and PhD work. In terms of scholarship and work that I think is really important to engage with this, I find Michel Foucault's concept of biopower useful. Foucault's a French philosopher, and he talks about biopower as practices that norm and control bodies. And biopolitics helps us understand how states regulate the health, reproduction, and demographics of particular populations under their control. In the case of Indigenous people, state-controlled biopower is an extension of practices that aim to control Indigenous claims to territory. And so by limiting Indigenous body size and population size, they can limit Indigenous claims to territory. And so to understand the colonization of Indigenous bodies, we have to start with understanding the colonization of Indigenous land. I also find an article by Akil Mbebe called Necropolitics really useful. And Mbebe talks about how governments and other controlling regimes determine who will live and who will die. And so in this case, it's about determining who is at risk for something that they're framing as a negative and whose bodies require intervention. And so I find those sort of questions very interesting. So let's look at some of the images that have shaped our approach to Indigenous women's bodies, particularly within health. This is an image of America from about 1580. So on the left, we've got a character, Amerigo Vespucci, a real Italian explorer of the world, discovering America. And the image is filled with symbolism. So Vespucci carries a staff representing religious power. It's got a little cross up at the top of it. He has a navigational astrolabe representing scientific power, the ability to cross the oceans. And he has a sword representing military power. And Europeans drew on images of Mother Nature to personify the continents that they were now exploring as an inviting female body. And we see this theme show up in art and also in literature. So early settler colonist Thomas Morton describes what's currently New England as being like a fair virgin longing to be sped to meet her lover in a nuptial bed, decked in rich ornaments to advance her state. And so we see this image sort of recurring of European men encountering America as an attractive female body. And Louis Montrose notes that by about the 1570s, artists had started to personify America in similar ways, usually as a bare-breasted woman wearing a feathered headdress. And that's what we see here, the female personification of America. She's got a feathered cap and a loincloth of feathers and is mostly naked, but wears gold bracelets, in this case on her leg. She's, in the words of Sir Walter Raleigh, large, rich, and beautiful. But there's also a danger. Professor of American Indigenous Studies, Emelise Marubio, describes this figure as a Native American queen. The warrior queen's nakedness and physical repose, she writes, invites the colonizer's gaze and his exploration, but her sisters in the background are roasting and eating a human leg, and this suggests his actual vulnerability. So here we have one of the early prototypes of a femme fatale. in trope of Indigenous land as a feminine body. This is an image of America as a Native American warrior queen by Belgian artist Martin de Vos from somewhere in the 1500s. She's sitting on an armadillo and she's carrying weapons and turns her back on the past, represented by the left side of this image, and looks toward the future, represented on the right, and toward military conquest. And if we look close up at the image of the past, represented on the left, we see a man hunting in the background, we see a man cutting up human limbs, and a woman roasting a human leg. The message here, I think, is that if left undominated, ungoverned, Indigenous bodies, especially perhaps Indigenous women, will resort to ungodly overconsumption, turning against European men. So what's my point? Why are images of Europeans' imagined cannibalism among the Americans important to Indigenous health? Well, I think that images of Indigenous territories as a feminine other partakes in a binary in which men are associated with the intellect and women are associated with the body. And then control of the body by the mind justifies the leadership of men and masculinized subjects. So for instance, Elizabeth's Virgin Queen, England's Virgin Queen Elizabeth, rather, the first, and domination over particularly women and others who are framed as feminine. So this binary is interesting, and a lot of my work examines that. Marubio notes that the figure of the Native American queen eventually becomes less popular and is replaced by an image she calls the Indian princess. The princess is a more romantic figure than the queen and is often paired as the counterpart to a European male. She's often presented as siding with the colonizers against her own people. So for example, here we see this image of the mythical story of Pocahontas rescuing Captain John Smith from death and becoming friends with the English at Jamestown in what is currently Virginia. In comparison to the Native American queen, the princess is still beautiful, but she's no longer presented as large and rich. Instead, she's presented as naive and unsophisticated, and this is used to justify patriarchal domination. But we still see the princess associated with death, this time her own. So Marubio notes that in American films, the princess figure usually dies to make space for a more suitable European wife. And this is an example from Disney. So by the time we get to Disney's take-up of the Indian princess trope in their 1995 film Pocahontas, the flirtatious princess is as slender as Barbie. So this is quite a number of steps away from the larger-bodied Native American queen, but it's in that same sort of line of representing Indigenous women as this exotic other. As settlers start to endorse thinner body ideals, the image of the Native American queen also gets refigured. And so we get it split. The queen becomes refigured as the Indian squaw, usually with a collection of neglected babies. So the squaw figure is marked by excess fat, excess sexual appetite, and excess reproduction. And this example is from Disney's Peter Pan from 1953. And this image I find very similar to later stereotypes of the Black welfare queen that people engaged in the 1980s around Reaganomics, for instance. So why do these images matter to Indigenous health? Well, I think Indigenous peoples have been consistently framed as requiring government intervention, control, and surveillance. And the control of Indigenous bodies, particularly women's bodies, tends to be linked to the justification of settler conquest of Indigenous territories. So in both the US and Canada, health research funders have framed obesity as an epidemic. And so I was interested in what exactly is this epidemic? What constitutes the problem as they see it? So for example, in the US, the National Institute for Health funding for obesity rose from about 50 million in 1993 to over 400 million in 2004. And similarly in Canada, from 2001 to 2021, CIHR, the Canadian Institutes of Health Research, which is the major national funder for health and research in Canada, invested nearly 20 million, studying obesity among Indigenous people in Canada. This was 13% of the Indigenous health research funding for that same period. And since 2014, CIHR has funded this project, the initiative Pathways to Health Equity for Aboriginal Peoples, which identifies obesity, often conflated with diabetes, as one of 4 priority health areas for Indigenous people. So to find out what exactly do they mean by obesity, what's the role of fat in this, I searched the Canadian Research Information System to see how fat was being understood and framed in projects that were funded by the government. So I used terms like Aboriginal, Indigenous, First Nations, Métis, and Inuit. And then I used a number of terms that might be used to identify that the project is related to fat in some way. So weight, obesity, fat, and came up with a number of results. I read 271 research abstracts, and then I weeded out the studies that didn't address Indigenous body weight or that focused on a population that was outside of Canada. And I came away with 117 relevant studies. 40 of these abstracts used obesity as a keyword, but they didn't provide enough information to determine how it was being framed. So that's a significant number of projects that identify a problem, but don't actually define it. 38 of those abstracts associated obesity with diabetes, either by saying obesity and diabetes, or by using a slash between the two, suggesting that they're the same thing in some way. 27 of those abstracts framed fatness as a disease, and 20 framed it as a general health problem. 16 recognized it as a risk factor for health problems, and 11 framed it as a negative health outcome. 8 used it as a quality or an attribute, such as the phrase obese women, and then 8 incorporated into a concept that they named cardiometabolic syndrome. And this was defined to include insulin resistance, impaired glucose tolerance, high cholesterol, high blood pressure, and fat deposits at the waist. So what I concluded from this was that health researchers and the committees that fund them perceive obesity as a health issue, but they disagree about whether it constitutes a disease, a risk factor for a disease, or a negative health outcome. And this lack of specificity makes obesity extremely flexible as a tactic for Indigenous population control. So who is the focus of these state interventions? Like the symbology of America that I showed you a moment ago, this knowledge production focuses primarily on Indigenous women. So among the abstracts that did address gender, only 1 study focused exclusively on men. 13 of the studies focused on pregnant women, usually in the case of gestational diabetes, and 16 focused on Indigenous youth. So the knowledge being produced through obesity studies funded by the Canadian government in this period manifests biopower by norming and controlling bodies primarily of Indigenous women and youth. So what do they propose to do about fat? It's interesting. Where the interventions are described as part of the abstract, 56 promote changes to diet and exercise that occur at the individual, family, or community level, and 6 of those imply a genetic cause for weight gain. Only 12 of the abstracts mention policy solutions, and only 2 mention colonialism as a factor that shapes Indigenous health. This suggests that government funding practices locate the problem of obesity in Indigenous women ourselves, and our failure to understand nutrition, to control what we eat, or to exercise enough. The tendency to focus interventions on individuals shifts research away from examining policy and government practices, and it particularly obscures the economic and colonial aspects of fat, such as benefits that accrue to settler corporations, which produce food by monocropping traditional territories, destroying animal habitats and traditional food economies. So the promotion of weight control interventions for Indigenous populations also supports a framework in which Indigenous people are pressured to assimilate, particularly to white settler norms around class, morals, and body shape. And this is where I feel like my research got really fun, because I examined this poster about diabetes produced by Health Canada. And so controlling the symbolic body of Indigenous America and relating it to colonial practices that shape literal bodies, I've been finding really interesting. So in this poster, for instance, we can see that personal responsibility framework showing up, where they talk about eat right, be active, you can prevent diabetes. So we see individual responsibility framed within a neoliberal context. It's about food choice. We also see communal responsibility, where they write, our lifestyle is important to us as a family, and we know the best way to avoid diabetes is to eat healthy foods. So the locus of power is framed at the family level through these bullet points. We have a healthy lifestyle, a spirit, and a goal, and the power to prevent diabetes. Looking at the images, the older woman is touching some green-topped carrots. She's sort of in the middle toward the back there. The younger woman is chopping celery at the kitchen table and smiling at a toddler who eats fruit that's been cut up into a white bowl. On the back and the right, a man stirs something at the stove. And the eye line of both the man and the younger woman is on the child, suggesting that Indigenous parents are responsible for the size and health of their children. The kitchen reflects middle-class values of cleanliness and consumerism. So we see a white gas stove with a digital readout. There's a white dishwasher, a white coffee maker. All the objects in the room are new, and white dominates in the cabinets, window frame, and blinds. The silver faucet over the sink indicates that this is not one of those First Nations families that's been living without running water for multiple generations. In front of the younger woman, we see carrots, fennel, squash, and a large bowl of seeds or nuts, half a red onion, a portobello mushroom, and 3 tomatoes. In the foreground lie 2/3 of a trout and some parsley. The missing section of fish might explain the frying pan on the stove, whose contents are not visible. The image implies financial and nutritional abundance. So food preparation here is idealized. Although the father character appears to be cooking, there's no steam or smoke emerging from the pans. I used May 2018 Grocery Gateway prices for downtown Toronto to find out how much would this food have cost in the time when it was prepared, when this poster came out. And it would have cost $52.29 to purchase the things on the table in the foreground. Indigeneity is symbolized here in embroidered potholders, in a medicine wheel feather sun catcher on the window, in the corn in a basket hanging on the cupboard, and in the long braided hair of the man at the stove. These images are loosely associated with the nations of the plains, but the fish on the cutting board may be a reference to traditional coastal foods. The woman in the poster wears long sleeve shirts and silver jewelry. And here I'm seeing a type of sexual morality represented in modesty. The woman's top is tucked into her jeans, which are belted at the waist, revealing her body size. The man and the younger woman wear matching wedding bands. Just as the control of appetite is demonstrated by the younger woman's body size, so too is her reproduction. While First Nations women average 2.7 children each, this poster presents a fertility rate lower than that of white women, which are about 1.6 children each, the lowest in Canada. The younger woman's disciplined eating and reproduction protect her from being put into the category of a representation of squaw and shift her to that of princess. Here, her support for colonial authorities or colonial health expertise bring Indigenous people in line with colonial standards of civilization. So that's an example of some of my work at the intersection of critical fat studies and Indigenous health. I'll end with this image. It's another American figure. This is a Dutch engraving from 1671, and we see the large, rich queen topless in the feathered cap, here portrayed with darker skin. I'm interested in how the Indigenous obesity epidemic is related to broader colonial symbols, such as the Indian queen or the Indian princess, and to systems of oppression, such as classism, sexism, racism, and homophobia, that interlock with or are rooted in colonialism. And so the premise of this work is that colonial body norms could be challenged if we decentered work that is rooted in binaries of domination and instead centered Indigenous values related to food, body size, and body meaning. I'll thank you here for your time and your attention, and I look forward to the discussion and to hearing what you see in this image and these ideas.
Thank you, Margaret. That was great. Such an interesting and important subject. I did see a hand there for a second. If we just want to raise our hands, and then I'll make sure the mic is unmuted and we can go ahead with questions or comments.
Thank you.
Give everyone a second to think about it.
Margaret, I have a question about how, so thank you for that talk. I have a question about how the perception of the Health Canada, you know, kind of imagery that's being used, how that is cycling back to address what you described as a dearth of policy or kind of system level responses. And I'm wondering, you know, was the federal government, Health Canada, other folks who are pushing out this messaging, are they open to addressing these types of concerns, and the policy gap being one, and then the sort of depiction of Indigenous populations as somehow being responsible for, in isolation from this broader policy landscape that you alluded to, are responsible for obesity in Canada. Be provocative.
Well, I guess if I imagine myself as funding research in Canada, I might pass the buck and say, well, we don't decide what people study or how they're framing it. That's down to the individual researcher. But if they wanted to promote policy-based studies or work that did look at colonialism as an upstream cause for various health issues, they can always do a specific call for studies in that field. And so they have done specific calls related to issues of obesity and have identified it as a health priority for Indigenous populations. And so because it was a health priority, I was interested to see how are they framing it, or how are the people who are responding to their call framing it. And it was all over the map. The only thing people seemed agreed about was that the interventions should be mostly at the individual or community level. And in this regard, we see general practices related to size management reflected. Like we see the same pattern in settler obesity projects. They're not looking at policy there much either. There's a little bit looking at class in terms of how food choices are shaped by economics, but they really do focus it primarily on sort of what people choose to eat. Ignoring that choice may be highly curtailed and that some choices are not as free as others.
Thanks for that, Margaret.
Yeah, that's a great response. We have a comment in the chat here. Alexia accidentally raised her hand, but she says, this was absolutely phenomenal. As an English major, I absolutely love the analysis of the images. There's always so much above and beneath the surface of an image. The narratives they initiate or perpetuate can be powerful. Thanks so much for this work. Yeah, that's a great point.
I found the images were a really great starting point to help me understand how might there be thoughts about Indigenous bodies as in relation to size particularly. And so reading critical fat studies picks up all of these issues. Some of the works that I've read, Abigail Sagi looks at the history of how fat has been addressed in America and how attitudes toward body size changed dramatically depending on what group of immigrants they were attempting to lure to America. So when rich German immigrants were coming, suddenly body size, larger bodies were framed as very positive, as a sign of wealth and affluence. And that if you had a larger body size, that indicated you were a successful person and people should listen to you. And now we see that that has changed dramatically. And so it's interesting to look at how they've charted that historically. And Sagi identifies all kinds of elements shaping how and how quickly frameworks of attitudes toward fatness socially change, and how people use very different frameworks to engage body size. It's not just medical. So people are attaching moral significance, economic significance. The body is constantly being taken to mean something else. And so I found that very interesting, especially connecting it to colonialism, to see what do people think the Indigenous women's bodies mean, and how does that play into attempts to control and shape them?
Yeah. It's such a huge subject that is in so many aspects of our society that I feel like is not often actually considered. Yeah. There's another comment here from Shannon Grant. Thank you for this. I've recently been engaging in critical rhetorical analysis of health messages with colleagues' support. And this presentation increased my learning, adding dimensions. Many thanks. There's also a comment from Bernadette Russo. Thank you, Margaret, for a wonderful presentation. As part of my research, I've recently begun to explore representation of food and food desserts in Indigenous literatures. Please, does your work consider these topics, and does your work explore countering Indigenous representations?
I suspect that maybe Bernadette is talking about food deserts, and I have encountered that, a work on food deserts. I read it as desserts too at first. Yeah, so a food desert is a place that someone might live where to get to a grocery store, you might have to walk for miles and miles. So this can be an urban area where the only places around you to get food maybe offer fast food. So there might be a McDonald's and a Popeye's chicken and a KFC, but there isn't a grocery store where you could buy fresh produce. And so folks like Conor Briggs Jr. Have talked about food deserts as a tactic of class and race warfare in the US. As a way to prevent Black communities, particularly, from advancing economically, and as what I would call a form of necro-politics of really forcing Black bodies to be less healthy. And so it is an interesting issue. For Mi'kmaq people, I would frame food deserts in relation to centralization. So forcing people off their traditional territories, to forcing people to live in isolated areas, often places where you couldn't do some of your traditional food economy activities, and sort of saving the good farmland for white settlers. And so I think some of that is important to connect up in terms of Indigenous representation. I have noticed a theme where some research recognizes that Indigenous communities view larger bodies positively, or do not attach body size to elements of attraction or attractiveness or of personal value. And so I don't want to frame it as like it's all great on the Indigenous side, but I think there are elements there that I see maybe echoed in queer communities in terms of just having different ways of valuing the body.
Thank you. Kylie, I think you might be good to go if you want to.
Yeah, thank you so much.
Okay.
So Margaret, thank you so much for your talk. I'm in the nutrition department at the Mount, and so much of what you shared today resonates with what we're trying to teach our students, and really trying to think about this systems approach rather than an individual approach to this whole concept. But when you went through that last image, I think it was PHAC, that image, or whoever made it. It's just so interesting because you see this like huge amount of fresh fruits and vegetables and fresh fish. And I guess like the reality, if you're thinking of a program like Nutrition North, that is not the reality of what folks can actually purchase in so many Indigenous communities across the country. And so I wonder if you can speak to anything that you know about programs like Nutrition North, or any analyses that you've done in that realm to try and contrast it with this individual, like person-centered responsibility that you've kind of uprooted in your research.
Yeah, well, looking at the cost of the food at the time, and for like what would it cost to purchase this food in downtown Toronto, I can't even imagine what the price tag for that meal would have been like in Northwest Territories, or where I was in Yellowknife recently, and just the difference there in terms of what is available and how much things cost, it was quite dramatic. And so I think there are the Canadian government benefits enormously from having people living in the North in order to be able to claim that territory as part of Canada. And so a number of Indigenous scholars have done work on that issue, calling them sort of like human flagpoles, essentially, and talking about how particularly the relocation of Inuit communities has been highly devastating to traditional food economies there. And then within critical animal studies, I've looked at how attitudes toward seal hunting, particularly from animal rights activists, have framed the Inuit as somehow making bad food choices because they choose to eat seal, as if there were an abundance of other types of food sitting around that were available. And so I think when we destroy a traditional food economy in order to achieve particular colonial ends, like being able to claim the North against Russian claims or something like that, I think we really have to ask ourselves how those policies have shaped people's ability to participate in their traditional economies, to share food knowledge and pass it on to their children. Because people have been living in different areas of this continent for thousands and thousands and thousands of years, and they kind of had it down, like they knew what they were doing. And so we need to maybe put more energy and more resources towards decolonizing the North and decolonizing places where traditional food economies could still be going on. That, when people are asked, what do you want to eat? They're often wanting to eat traditional, or what they sometimes call country foods. But because of environmental degradation and different like pollutions and problems like that, mercury from dams, often the food doesn't taste the same, or the food may not be safe to eat in some places. And so when Canada makes decisions about what kind of economic benefits they're going to get out of particular projects, for instance, like a hydroelectric dam, I think they need to start calculating in the damage to the Indigenous food economy that's going to cost, and also to counter with the cost that it's going to be for nationally paid health programs. That, if it's not actually going to make you money on the health end because it's so damaging to people's well-being, it's not really a profit, is it?
Thank you so much.
Thank you. So we have a few more chat comments here. Rachel says, this work is so important. Thank you for sharing with us today. Appreciate the critical lens while also considering funding nationally. Yeah. Lisa says, the Canadian Ranger system is specifically to maintain northern sovereignty via Indigenous participants. Shannon says, hear, hear. Food and medical care in the north are highly colonized. Bullets, etc. cost beyond what people can afford at the northern. The winter roads are not freezing as long as they used to, increasing annual food prices. I worked there for several years, and all of this deeply resonates. Thanks again. Such important work. Yeah.
Well, even like as a Mi'kmaq person, if I want to get traditional foods that my ancestors would have eaten up to 13,000 or more years ago, accessing those foods can be really difficult. If they're not sold at a grocery store nearby, it's not often feasible to go and seek them out to harvest them traditionally, because I'm not perceived as owning the land on which they grow. It's sometimes framed as crown land, or it's framed as private property. And a lot of the places where traditional foods would have been supported to grow, those areas have been destroyed by clear cutting or similar processes. So now that Mi'kmaq people are taking more of an active role in many of the resource management in the Maritimes and Mi'kma'ki, I think I'm expecting to see maybe different practices and more of a broader concern for animal relatives in terms of some of that decision making around resource management. But I guess I'll have to wait and see how it plays out.
Yeah, that's such a critical point of connecting to the land. Yeah. Does anyone else?
I think Shannon had her hand up.
Shannon?
No, I typed it. I have a little sick boy with me today, so I'm gonna keep it muted.
Fair. Yeah, Emily, go ahead.
Hi, it's Chelsea. I'm here with Emily. Nice to see you, Margaret, and thank you so much for your awesome presentation. Just wanted to make a comment about like your description of the images and how I really resonated with that. Normally, like when I'm talking about or teaching about like colonization, I often talk about, you know, the origins of policy and like all of these ideas that are embedded in those. So things like the Gradual Enfranchisement Act and those things that kind of shaped what the Indian Act is. And so I just really found that those images that you use really fit well with the policy and how I've described those policies too. So I just think they'll be, yeah, a nice addition to how I explain, you know, the context of those things sometimes, especially like, I don't know, I just find images and art sometimes just shows something better than just describing it. So anyway, just wanted to say thank you for sharing all of that. And sorry for the dog in the background. I brought him today with us. So anyways, yeah, thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, I agree with you about the images. Not only do they reveal how Europeans were talking about America and Americans, but they also they shape the people who see those images. And so they're both reflecting a European view, but they're also promoting it and encouraging people to think that way too. And so it's, I mean, as a queer scholar doing critical research, it's amazing because they're sexualizing the America character, they're feminizing her, they're dominating her sexually, they're describing her as sort of just almost like a potential victim of an attack of some sort, because they're describing like she's got all these goodies that she doesn't know what to do with, and she needs us to come and sort of take care of it all and work it all out. And like the fantasy that they are attached to of male conquering, it's not even subtle. And so, you know, for a scholar looking at heterosexism or binary gender elements, it's just absolutely fraught with them. And for someone looking to see how are Indigenous people being represented and how does that play out in our daily lives now, you know, connecting it to issues of missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls and Two-Spirit people, you can definitely see that as a potential connection to these images of sexual domination of the land and of the population. And so I think when it comes to issues around how do we get pressured to conform to particular body norms, we're getting pressured at all of these levels, as Indigenous women, as people who they see as potentially reproducing, and maybe as decision makers around food content and food choices and food economies. And we look historically back and we see how Indigenous women got pushed out of powerful positions in food economies, particularly ones that were plant-based. So for instance, residential schools taught Indigenous men how to farm according to European farming traditions, but they destroyed generations of Indigenous women's farming knowledge by preventing it from being passed on. And instead they trained Indigenous women to cook, clean, make clothes, really to be a servant class. And so I find it's amazing all the linkages that start coming through, all back to one image that really kind of captures a perspective on us that is distorted in some way.
Margaret, can I ask how that conversation in the Canadian context transcends or connects to Indigenous populations in other countries? Like I'm thinking, you know, in Australia, New Zealand, etc. And so have you sort of looked at how that, you know, kind of popular imagery and distortion as depicted in the images you shared today, how those are or are not reflected in other Indigenous populations elsewhere in the world?
So I've done less work looking at those, but from what I have seen, I've noticed tendencies to represent the Maori is very large. Tendencies particularly to represent Maori men as large and threatening. And so there I see the gender is, they're doing something different with the gendered images. And I haven't heard of Indigenous obesity work in Australia, but I know from looking at other issues that we see a lot of similar colonial practices there. So I would expect that health funders in those areas of New Zealand or Australia might also be doing similar things, centering Indigenous women as the targets for anti-obesity research or anti-obesity interventions of some sort. But you definitely do see a continuation of the "it's not us, it's you" trend of like thinking it's about you're making bad decisions, or maybe you just have a genetic predisposition to this. And so that idea that it's on us to fix the problem that they have identified for us, I would imagine the dynamic would be very similar to that.
Yeah, really interesting, Margaret. Thank you for that. And it kind of reminds me of the fact that if funding bodies, like you use the example of Canadian Institutes of Health Research or CIHR, having calls for the Pathways funding program. And so you could just imagine perhaps in other countries where national health funding agencies are shaping the quote unquote problem based on episurveillance data, for example, devoid of the sort of context within which traditional food ways have been destroyed. So, I mean, it's interesting to think that those calls for proposals, you know, may have actually been instituted without a whole lot of consultation, potentially with so-called affected communities. And I just wonder if you could reflect on how we can do better within health funding research, for example.
Yeah, it's kind of like it makes its own business, like by putting out a call for people to submit abstracts related to Indigenous obesity, you enable people to center themselves as Indigenous obesity experts, and then you financially reward them for training other people to also be Indigenous obesity experts. And so it's its own small business in some ways. And I haven't found that CIHR is very open to critical approaches to fatness that would engage other meanings of fatness apart from a very biomedical framework. So they're not very open to holistic wellness that might see size as positive, for instance. I remember being in a meeting where I proposed some that we include critical fatness approaches to something that we were doing, and they sort of laughed a little bit, like maybe I was just too naive to understand how obesity worked. But then they also suggested that including critical approaches was insulting to all the people who had worked so hard to become fat scholars and were experts in obesity and should just be listened to. And so I didn't find that was really a place where they were going to look at other framings for obesity. Now, that might be changing. So a systematic review appeared in the Journal of American Medical Association, which is a big medical journal, that found that what they called grade 1 obesity, so having a BMI of 30 to 35. So me as a 5'1" person, if I weighed 185 pounds, I'd be in grade 1 obesity. They found that that was not associated with higher mortality. And that being overweight, so someone my height who weighed 160 pounds instead, was associated with lower mortality. And so after years and years of telling everyone that being larger makes you sick and makes you die, they now have found that maybe that's not the case, that certain amounts of body fat that they consider excess are actually either neutral toward health or supportive of health. And so a number of people have responded to that study since. It was fairly recent. But one of the things that they've pointed out is that in relation to longevity, how do we separate the effects of weight loss treatment from the effects of weight loss? And they've asked, there's a lack of methods that establish that losing weight actually prolongs life, that we haven't had randomized controlled studies with human beings that actually establish that weight loss supports longer living. And so how do we tease apart the conditions under which people of larger size live, including all of the oppressions that they experience and the disabling worlds in which they have to move, from the fact of having more fat on the body, that you can't tease apart the physical and the social, and that those are actually really intertwined. So in this regard, I feel like the experience of Indigenous people needs to be put in conversation with other populations that are in similar positions. So queer women, for instance, are often centered as being too large, And again, I feel like that's a population that they already think there are maybe too many of us and that we should be smaller than we are. So if they start being concerned about the obesity interventions needed for rich white men, then I might think, well, maybe they just care about making bodies smaller, but generally they haven't been focusing on those people.
That's great, and I'm wondering what your thoughts are on the faulty metric known as the BMI and what that does for particular populations, and how the BMI has been kind of chucked out of the scientific rigor category. I wonder if you could speak to that in terms of Indigenous populations.
Sure. Indigenous populations, when they've been asked about body size, have generally associated larger body size with safety, with strength, and with healthiness. And so it's a challenge, as a lot of health researchers see it, to work with Indigenous communities that value fat babies. And so trying to justify weight loss programs to people who don't think weight loss is valuable, from a settler perspective, that's a concern, because Indigenous studies that I've seen don't tend to suggest that size is maybe the same health priority. I think that's maybe why they've conflated it with diabetes, because Indigenous people do see diabetes as a health priority, and they do see negative outcomes associated with that. But there's a lot about diabetes that doesn't have to do with body size. And so I think there's a number of places where legitimate health concerns of Indigenous communities are being intertwined with things that in many ways are really meant not for our well-being, but might be aimed at trying to control our population, control our general size and shape, control what kind of norms we adhere to. And really, I would put under a category of like civilizing efforts, trying to make us more like other Europeans. And so there's this trend there that I see that makes me really uncomfortable. I think if we want to center research again put the power back in Indigenous communities, some of that work is going to look at well-being that considers other factors, that don't look at, what was the number on the scale today, and that determines how you feel about yourself the rest of the week. I think there's a little too much stress associated with constant weight management and weight surveillance, particularly for women. One of the best things my partner ever did for my mental well-being was ask me to get rid of the scale.
That's great, Margaret. Are there other questions before we wrap up?
There is one comment here from Patrick. In BC, the First Nation and Inuit Health Branch, Health Canada has devolved, and now there's the First Nation Health Authority. It'll be interesting to follow their stats with the change from a colonial approach back to a more traditional approach. I imagine it will be a model that other First Nations and provinces will follow. Yeah.
I hope so, Patrick. I mean, I think sometimes there can be pressure when Indigenous people are finally authorized to make their own decisions about things, that those efforts are going to be evaluated on a very settler colonial scale. And so, depending on what the metrics are by which they're assessing success, people may get pressured to just do the same thing that previous institutions or controlling bodies were doing. But if they don't do that, if they take a more traditional approach, or if they take a different approach, looking at upstream systemic causes of unwellness, I think that could be really exciting. And I'm really excited to see what they're going to do there in BC.
Thank you. I think we might have time for one final question or comment. If not, it'll be over to Jackie for our closing.
Yeah, I do agree with Leanne. Looking forward to the evolution of Eskikewákik in Nova Scotia. Yeah, to see what will Mi'kmaq health look like.
Yeah.
Okay, so if there aren't any other questions, I'm going to just say again, thank you so much to Dr. Robinson for a really great talk. It was really enjoyable and fascinating, actually. As somebody who was in health promotion for many, many years, it's a very fascinating talk. So thank you for that. Thank you to Liz for all things logistics. Thank you to Emily as our moderator. And just a gentle reminder to please complete the feedback form. And it's not about today's talk as much as it is about making sure the Black and Indigenous Speaker Series is actually meeting its objectives. So it's not about Margaret. It's about how well this series is meeting its objectives. And we're also very happy to entertain any and all suggestions for speakers for our 2023-2024 Black and Indigenous Speaker Series. You can send those suggested names and Liz will follow up with those suggestions. So please do send in your suggestions to Liz as well as your feedback form. And again, thank you very, very much, Margaret. It's always a pleasure. And we're going to wrap it up now with a thank you to everybody for being here. And again, thank you, Liz. Thank you, Emily. Thank you, Margaret.
Well, thank you.
Thank you so much, Margaret. And everyone. Have a great day.
You too.